I said I would always make some remarks about the news. I thought as the Nobel Prizes in economics have been granted today, and one of the names is not familiar to me, so I can't say anything because I didn't, as I said, I literally saw the news before I left for coming here. The other two are familiar, and it's quite interesting that at least these two, have been put together as sharing a particular Nobel Prize because they do represent very much extremely different streams within economic science. Mr. Eugene Fama is very much part of the mainstream. He's one of the last representative of the Chicago school, let's say the classical Chicago school. He's very much in the same group as people like Markowitz, who had a Nobel Prize earlier. He's part of that building of an economic science, very much mimicking physics, mimicking the part of physics called mechanics. He should have normally, according to everybody's opinion, have received a Nobel Prize a long time ago. I guess it's because there was a reversal in trend. There was a kind of questioning of whether that type of economics was very much useful, that he hasn't received one before this year. It sounds a bit to me like, you know, these Oscars being given to some people for a lifetime achievement, and that comes usually to an actor or an actress who's deserved to receive an Oscar for years and years and has never received one before and is getting pretty old, and people are worried that they won't receive the Oscar they deserve before they die. That looks very much what that Nobel Prize in economics for Eugene Fama sounds like. I would say that very much the type of economics that he represents is the one that's been questioned by the current crisis. The current crisis has very much shown that that part of the economic theory is wrong, that doesn't work. And also, as I think I alluded already, some part of economic theory has been built in the knowledge of the previous parts of it being false, not being confirmed by facts, by data. And that part of economics has been built in knowingly in order not to question the pre-existing parts of it. I think that's the whole construction that will actually be forgotten sometime in the future. Mr. Schiller, I think it's Robert Schiller, is a part of a what's called the neo-Keynesian part of economics. It's not exactly in the tradition of what John Maynard Keynes did, but it is a compromise between mainstream economics and the existing and the tradition instaured by John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes, as you may know, 1883, 1946, died some time ago, 3/4 of a century ago, but had introduced another way of looking into economic theory. Schiller has written recently a book called Animal Spirits. Animal Spirits is a notion that I will come back to probably sometime in the lectures. Animal Spirits is a notion that Keynes introduced to refer to the uncontrollable part of the future, the things we cannot know about the future, because it derives from so many different elements which are totally unpredictable separately, and together produce a combination which is even more unpredictable. Schiller has written that book in collaboration, co-authored it with George Akerlof, who's already a Nobel Prize of Economics and is sometimes mentioned now in the news because he's the husband of Janet Yellen, who has just been appointed to replace Ben Bernanke at the head of the Federal Reserve, the American Central Bank. Schiller also introduced, it's interesting because I mentioned in the first lecture, I mentioned that around Alan Greenspan, who was from 1987 to 2006, was at the head of the Federal Reserve. He was surrounded by a group of people who didn't believe in financial bubbles. So it's interesting that Schiller devoted a book to financial bubbles, probably written in something like 2001 or 2002, called Irrational Exuberance. He called that book Irrational Exuberance, essentially because that phrase had been assigned to Alan Greenspan. But Alan Greenspan was actually quoting him from an article, and so I think he tried to get the claim back on that, on that phrase by calling a book by that term. And in that book, he calls bubbles, financial bubbles, he called them spontaneous Ponzi schemes, which is interesting. The Ponzi scheme is therefore, as you know, that construction where there's no proper economic mechanism at work, but there is a machine which has been set where people who have joined the scheme early on are paid by the people coming in. Of course, it has no economic value, but it can work for a while if you, how would I say, if you monitor very precisely the stream of people coming in and the people were already there. And therefore, Schiller called that financial bubbles. He made a comparison with these Ponzi schemes by saying that there was a spontaneous process of Ponzi scheme. Another Nobel Prize in economics called Momigliano had shown that many years ago, probably in the 1980s, had shown that the operation of a bank, which has a number of activities, is always, to some extent, prompted by the existence within that bank of some of the activities working in a Ponzi scheme, and that as long as all of them don't work simultaneously in that particular, on that particular mode, the machine can actually operate. Okay, this was just an aside to the news. Last time I addressed the question of whether rational behavior is automatically ethical. And I had a double reflection about what we understand by rationality. And I went back quite back into the past by going to the traditional definition of rationality, which is the one that Aristotle in ancient Greece had proposed. And then I had a reflection about ethics. And for that, I went even further in the past and even further in the geography, because I use as my the examples to start from Confucianism and Taoism in ancient China. I showed that rationality, as we understand it currently in economic science, has got not much to do with the definition Aristotle had given. Rationality in economic science from the end of the 19th century is defined as a way to optimize scarce resources according to subjective utility. Today I will talk about this notion of the invisible hand, which has, at least until 2008, been mentioned time and again as being central to economics. When I say to economics, I don't refer to that early part of the economic science, which we call political economy, and which we can date from, let's say, the early 18th century to the final quarter, last quarter of the 19th century, as the new current economic science was very much started independently by three different people in the years 1870 to 1875. Jevons in Britain, Menger in Germany, and Walras, who was a Frenchman but who essentially taught in Lausanne University in Switzerland. from that time very much on, started that claim that ethics did not apply to finance, that there was what I call extraterritoriality. I can never pronounce it. I should find another phrase. Extraterritoriality of finance as far as ethics is concerned. It starts from that claim that the least you think about ethics when doing finance, the best your machine will operate, the overall mechanism will operate. It is usually assigned to Adam Smith because of a particular passage that I will read in his Wealth of Nations, a book he published in 1776, has been, as has been convincingly shown by Thomas Sedlacek in this book called Economics of Good and Evil, and we were lucky last year to have him as a guest of the course, and which is why I'm very pleased to have a signed copy of his book. In his book, he puts the emphasis on the fact that Sedlacek, on the fact that the views which are currently assigned to Adam Smith are essentially not his, and I made an allusion to that last time, but are essentially the views of somebody else, of Mandeville, Richard Mandeville, who was a, excuse me, it's not Richard Mandeville, Bernard Mandeville, who was a Dutch, not really an economist, but let's say more like a philosopher, or even more a pamphleteer, who lived essentially in England for most of his life, and who had written a book called The Fable of the Bees. That book was published in 1714. It became only famous with its second print in 1723, when it made a big scandal, because Mandeville essentially opposed the view that that virtues are what help a society to work together. If you wish to relate it to the background of my last lecture, he had a totally Confucianist view of society. The Confucianist view is essentially that if everybody works in an ethical way within society by being virtuous, although the word virtuous does not exist in that exact same way in ancient Chinese thought. But if we translate it in our system, if everybody is virtuous, then society works in a smooth manner. And the subtitle of Mandeville books is called Private Vices, Public Benefits. His thesis is essentially that that we are confused, that we should actually promote vices because they are how would I say, they feed the systems within which we work, while virtuous, if everybody was virtuous, the economy would come to a standstill, and that would be actually very detrimental to our society. And when, as I said, in 1723, there was an outcry when that book became famous. Every decent philosopher opposed it. And Sedlacek shows quite convincingly that actually Adam Smith, to whom most of these views are currently being assigned nowadays, was very much an opponent of Mandeville. That in his book called, which was published earlier in the 1750s, in his book, Adam Smith very much opposed the views of Mandeville. But because of the particular passage that I'm going to read from Adam Smith, and because current economists don't read much the books written by the ancestors, there was that confusion that led to, in particular, the Chicago School of Economics to regard Adam Smith to have been the promoter of that view that the least the law and ethics interfere with finance, the best things operate in the second part of the course, I will show some examples that suggest that that was only true when the economy was working in a totally balanced way. But as soon as that ceased to be the case, then that invisible hand actually vanished. There was somebody who recently said that if the invisible hand is invisible, it's essentially because it's not there. I may have mentioned who said that recently, but I don't remember right away who it is. So here's a famous passage of Smith, which is regarded as showing that he holds views similar to Mandeville. And because Mandeville is lesser known, and because Adam Smith is essentially regarded as the, how would I say, the forefather, the starting figure of economic theory, things have been assigned to him. Here's what Adam Smith said. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. The butcher generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it, but preferring to support the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, I'll do say it again, and by directing the industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was not part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the good public. It is an affectation, indeed, not very common among merchants, and very few words need to be employed in dissuading them from it. Now, of course, this is something that Adam Smith has written, and so we can't say he hasn't written. And but I think I mentioned already that it is the French philosopher Michel Foucault who had drawn the attention of why was Adam Smith why would he especially say that in that particular context within his particular book. And I think Michel Foucault very much got it right. It's saying this was still part of a discussion that was in the wake, in the later years after the British Revolution, the English Revolution, when the king was beheaded, and that for a while there was a republic. It was suggesting that the royal power, the monarchy, should not try to mingle, to bother with every little aspect of the economy, because there is a part that works on its own, and that too much regulation could actually hinder the operation of the economy. That not being hindered is a better way to let it operate. So to some extent, the message which has been revived by the people who created the Adam Smith Society, the people who in 2006 erected a statue, actually a bust of Adam Smith in Kilkenny, which is his birthplace in Scotland. To some extent, they have it right. They have understood the message which he's saying there. The issue is that he was not addressing to a modern type of state. He was addressing himself to a pretty authoritarian type of monarchy. So what does Adam Smith say? He says, well, it's not because the baker is obsessed by the client who will buy the bread that he manages to contribute to society, the operation of society. It's because he follows his interest to sell his bread and to make a profit out of it. But what Adam Smith doesn't say, and that's what led to our current problem, I would say, Adam Smith is not either saying that the baker is at war with his client, that he's trying to murder the person who buys bread. that there's an ultimate war between the people who buy bread and the bakers. No, he's not saying that either. And as you know, this is the way that his message to some extent has been transformed, that there's a war going on. And it culminates in the statement of Milton Friedman in the late 1960s. He got a Nobel Prize in, as far as I remember, 1976, where Friedman said that that the person who's leading a business is not working for his client, is not working for his employees, he's working only for his investor, only for the shareholder, if that's the person that, I mean, if the company has been organized in such a way that it is a company that issues shares. That view, that a company works only for its investors, is, I believe, introduce an unbalance into the system, which has a major role to play in the current situation. And I will mention three examples. One I mentioned last year, which is an incident that happened in 2008 with the company, the bank, the investment bank called Goldman Sachs. I will mention a second example, which is the operation of the bank called Dexia, which is a French and Belgian bank that has disappeared in 2012. And the last example I will mention is the current discussions which we have in the United States around the debt, around the budget, that led to a shutdown of the administration, a partial shutdown, and that may lead to a major crisis in what is it, in 3 days? In 3 days, if no agreement takes place about the ceiling that's currently existing about the American debt. So, two of the illustrations I will be giving today were not mentioned last year, but I think I set the frame by saying that what has changed the operation of the economy is the fact that that view became pervasive, that there's a war going on between a company and its clients, and that the company people have sided with the investors against the clients. The first illustration, as I said, will be the one from Goldman Sachs in 2008. In 2007, in February, and I went into some detail of explaining the subprime crisis in the first lecture. In 2007, in February, these subprime securities, those securities which had been made up by putting together something like 5,000 or 6,000 individual loans to people who were regarded as subprime borrowers, meaning that there was a likelihood that they may not pay back the money they had borrowed, and that they may not pay the interest on these as part of the installments they're supposed to make. But as I said, there was no mistake made, financially speaking, by lending them money, because we were in a context where the price of housing was going so fast up that the risk for the banks who were lending to these people was minimal. And I insist on that because I hear every day people are saying, well, subprime, they were lending money to people who couldn't repay. They were just stupid. No, I mean, there was a bubble, and within the bubble context, it was making perfect sense to do so. What was not making any economic sense was to believe that the bubble would not stop at some point, that would not burst at some point. But as I said, because in the authorities, the financial authorities, in particular Mr. Greenspan and the people around him, explained that bubbles do not exist. Therefore, there was no risk associated. And that was, why did he say that? As I said at the time, essentially because there was a major flaw simply in economic theory. These people had built these Nobel Prizes had built a theory which couldn't be supported by the fact. In the beginning of 2007, the price of housing had stopped going up by by August of 2006. 6 months later, the subprime people could not pay because, as I described in the first lecture, they needed the prices to go up permanently in order to be able to make their monthly payments, essentially because a number of them had used the fact that they could refinance their loan to simply pay their monthly installments, their monthly payments. By mid-2000, the price of the value of these securities starts going down dramatically in February 2007. By August 2007, we are in a situation where banks stop lending to each other, which is very much part of the, I would say, the normal process. Banks do sell and buy from each other debt they've been issuing, and they need to be able, when they want to lend to other people, they need to be able in a position when they can borrow themselves that money and simply re-lend it at a higher interest rate and make some profit on doing that. By mid-2007, banks stop lending to each other, or if you wish, which is the same, they only lend to each other at very, very high interest rates. That interbank rate is reaching such height that nobody can actually sustain that, and there's no circulation anymore of capital flows between different banks. That will lead that starts a process, of course, that will lead to the weakest of these banks to fall one after another. In March 2008, it is Bear Stearns, number 5 among the American investment banks that falls. It can't pay. It's insolvent. The fact that other banks have started betting on its downfall doesn't help the process. It helps them actually. It helps the company to become insolvent, to default on its payments. And another 5 or 6 months later, it's Lehman Brothers that number 4 among the American investment banks that has the same fate. On the day that Lehman Brothers disappears, number 3, Merrill Lynch, number 3 among the investment banks is bought by J.P. Morgan. Goldman Sachs is number 1 among the investment banks. Number 2 is Morgan Stanley. These two still stand, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. They were allowed in a hurry in September 2008 to ask for the status of commercial bank. Why did they need that? Because it is part of the role of the Federal Reserve of the American Central Bank to be able to help out commercial banks. It is not allowed to do so for investment bank. So if Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley were to be saved, they had to, by receiving money from the central bank, they had to acquire that status. But now, why do I use that Goldman Sachs as an example of what we can think about the invisible hand, whether it operates or not? It's because of the following. During that year, 2007, when Goldman Sachs realizes that there's something going on in the subprime industry, and they have a lot of these products that they part of their portfolio is being set. The first thing they do is that they try to sell that portfolio. There is something which is called asymmetry of information, which is that it's being said by mainstream economic theory that in order for markets to operate, there need to be symmetry of information, meaning that the seller and the buyer need to have access to the same information. Now, it's very difficult to organize that, because if somebody sells you an object, it goes without saying that person has got more information about that object than the potential buyer, because the seller knows the history of the object if it's second hand. it knows, for instance, it will sell you a car, a second-hand car, and it has legally to tell you some information about the history of the car, but there's no way possibly to tell all the information, right? Like that it was in a particular accident that doesn't show, but may have some incidence on the quality of the car. In the second part of 2007, Goldman Sachs tries to really take advantage from the fact that it knows a lot of information about the subprime market that its potential clients do not know. And the first thing they do is to sell some of these products, try to take advantage on the fact that their buyers don't know as much about how far the industry is actually coming down. This is, you would say, to some extent part of business. There is never a perfect symmetry, and it may happen that that you sell to somebody something at a particular price corresponding to a certain quality level, and actually the product doesn't have that quality level. What was incriminating for Goldman Sachs is that a Senate panel gathered all the information about that, and showing that the emails that had been circulating were showing some of the employees of Goldman Sachs actually mocking the people who would buy their product, saying things like, you know, that sucker doesn't even realize what we're selling him or her. There are some very, I would say, picturesque emails that people have been quoting at the time. Somebody saying, well, I found the white elephant we were looking for somewhere in Australia, and we're going to sell him some subprime. So this was not the invisible hand regulating the process automatically. I mean, the clients were really much regarded as, how would I say, victims in the process. But that example, I would say, wouldn't as such be totally incriminating, because we've seen things of that time before. What is the most incriminating is that Goldman Sachs created a particular product in order to encourage people to bet on the good health of that product, while they had knowingly made that product as bad as possible, and they would be betting on the other side. They would bet on the downfall of the product. How did they do that? They asked a hedge fund headed by a certain Mr. Paulson to organize a particular security backed by subprime loans to make it the worst possible. Now, what's interesting within the context of a lecture about the stewardship of finance is that Mr. Paulson, who had made a lot of money, billions of dollars, on the downfall of the subprime industry, hired Mr. Greenspan after he had left the Federal Reserve. That there is not much more of a scandal about things of that time is pretty worrying. So Goldman Sachs organized that particular security. It didn't sell it. It didn't sell it because if you sell it, let's say it's worth on the paper $5 billion, and you know from the information you have, from the asymmetry of information, it's only worth $4 billion now, and you sell it for $5 billion, well, you're making $1 billion, which is the difference between the actual value of the thing and the price for which you sell it, which is what happened in the first stage of the process. But now something happened which is different. They produced, the product was called a CDO, collateralized debt obligation. A CDO is made up of different types of elements, which can be entirely made out of subprime loans, but typically CDOs were made out of other elements, like leases on airplanes, or aggregated loans on camping cars, and things of that type. And Goldman Sachs prepared a particular CDO called Abacus and a number of, some numbers which I don't remember, because there were different types of abacus. And they tried to organize as many possible bets from other parties on the fact that the value of that product would go up, while they knew that it had been made as being the worst possible product. And they were betting in the opposite direction. So they were making money, actually, on the downfall of the subprime industry and altogether of the mortgage industry in the United States. As you understand, when you organize bets, you can get as many bets as you wish, independently of the actual value of the product. Let's say that that product, that abacus, I mean, the actual security behind the abacus bet was worth $5 billion. You can gather people betting for maybe $500 if you don't find many bettors. But you can possibly find people will be betting for $10 billion if you wish. It just depends how many people would be interested. It's just like in a horse race. How much money people will be betting on the horses has no relationship whatever with the value of the horse. I mean, the price for which you can buy or sell the horse is totally independent. It has no relationship. And so Goldman Sachs managed, by hiding information, by organizing these bets, to make a lot of money on the downfall and the fact that the industry was actually disappearing, was vanishing. And actually, it has not revived since then. We don't have a subprime industry by now. So what it shows then, I mean, why do I mention that example? Because it shows essentially that there's no invisible hand at work. That if the invisible hand worked more or less in normal times within the economy, it is quite obvious that in times like that, and with strategies of that particular type, there's no invisible hand. By following Goldman Sachs, by following its own advantage, was not working to the public good. It was working just to its own good, but it was destroying the public good quite deliberately by having its clients who were trusting the company to be a good company, enticing their clients to make bets that Goldman Sachs knew would be losing, that they would be losing on their side. It's difficult not to see a relationship between that particular attitude and what Friedman had said in years before, that the company should not have the sake of its clients as being it's part of its concerns, and that it's only the shareholders, the investors, who they should report to. I do believe that introduced an element which was extremely detrimental to the working of the economy. And that's why I made that little joke about the fact that the baker in the example of Adam Smith is following his own interest, but he's not at war with his clients. If he were at war with his clients, the quality would go lower. He may poison some of his clients and so on, and society would not be operating. There was, Goldman Sachs had to pay something in the order of $500 million for having done that. Quite interestingly, none of the companies who have done things of that type and who had to pay very large fines were ever prohibited from going on with that their activity. That's something that was never done in the recent crisis, that a company was prevented from going on operating the way excuse me, it had shown it had no particular talent or moral concern about how to do it. Fortunately, I don't have anything to drink. The head of excuse me about that. That's the remnants of a cold at the beginning of last week. The head of Goldman Sachs, Mr. Blankfein, was asked to come and testify in front of a senatorial panel. And his justification of what had happened was that that he lives in an environment where his clients are supposed to know their business, that they are informed, that they are that are parties who know, and that in his position, he's just selling products at a particular price, and that there can be negotiation about the price, but that his duty as a seller of a product doesn't go any further. It is for the buyer should know what he or she does, and there is nothing more that he should do. That leads me immediately to the second example I would like to suggest, which is the one with the Dexia Bank. Dexia Bank was the result of a fusion between Crédit Local de France and Crédit Communal and Crédit Banque. Is it Crédit Banque in how is it called in Flemish? The Crédit Communal? Gemeentekrediet? Gemeentekrediet. A fusion, as far as I remember, in 1996. And these two banks who were essentially lending to what we call the municipals in English, which is or collectivité locale, or gemeente in Dutch, is a bank which was very much regarded as being the steward of the economy, and in particular of its clients, which were these different communities at different levels within society, at the province level or the communal level, and so on. And there was regarded to be a, how would I say, an understanding between the bank and the client, that everybody would work for the, I would say, for the common interest and for the interest of the opposite parties. Now, when I don't remember exactly the name, the year in which they were allowed to become private company. But it became a private company, and at that time things really started to change. Now, I would like to say a word on the product that was sold to the communities, to the municipalities. When you say a product sold, in that case, it means essentially that there's a loan being made to one of these municipalities, and that there's a certain contract associated to it. The justification of changing the nature of the product what was the following. A municipality would like to borrow for a certain duration, and Dexia would lend the money, and there's a choice needs to be made whether the rate that would be associated to the loan would be fixed or would be floating. Now, you know that in on the markets, on the capital markets, rates are floating. What we mean by floating is just that their value varies. It varies very much according to demand and supply. There's a power relationship between the whole set of people who are prepared to lend money at a particular time and people who are prepared to borrow. And it's very much, I would say, the power relationship between these two groups that defines where the rate will be set. I already mentioned that there's an element, or another element within an interest rate, which is the risk premium, the element in the interest rate which represents which is there to act as a reserve for the possibility that the loan will be not reimbursed, or that the interest payments which are promised will not be made. If you set the rate at the time of a contract, if you say, well, for the whole length of the 10 years, it would be at a particular level, in the following years, the rates in the market would be may be going up or they may be going down compared to the rate will be set. Let me give an example. So you issue a loan, you grant a loan to somebody in 2001, and you decide to set the rate of the loan as being the current floating rate determined by the market, let's say 3.5, and you would add, I don't know, 0.5% as the profit for the bank who does it, so it brings to 4, and then you add, I don't know, 1% as the risk premium, so it's being set at 5. But then in the following years, the floating rate may become lower than that, or it may become higher than that. When the rates are low, it is the interest. When the rates are low, I would say in the market, it is in the interest of the borrower to have the rate to be fixed. Let's say that over the past 5 years, the rates have, for a 10-year loan, has fluctuated between 3 and 5. If currently it is 3.10, it's interesting for people to get a loan and have that floating part of the interest rate being fixed at 3.10, because you know that's low historically speaking. If you need to borrow, and currently the rate, market rate, is around 5, let's say 4.95, and then you know that that's quite high historically speaking, you may wish to ask the bank to give you floating rate, thinking that the likelihood is that the rate may come down. You will not want to have it fixed at 4.95 because you know that a few years before, people could borrow at fixed rate of 3. So the strategy of a borrower would be that he or she would like the rate to be fixed if it's currently low, historically speaking, and they would prefer to have it being floating if it's currently high, knowing that if it comes down, you may then try to renegotiate and want to have a fixed rate loan because the market currently allow that. Now, Dexia developed a product which is the following, which is that you have a fixed loan, a fixed rate loan, and the rate has actually been fixed at a lower level than the current market rate. So when I say that, you know, you still have to take into account the 0.5% which goes to profit to the bank, and maybe the 1% which is the risk premium. But let's say that the floating rate currently is 3. Well, actually, Dexia will give you a loan on the basis of 2.75. Now, why would the bank do that? The explanation will be given. Now, the reasoning of Dexia in making a product like that is that we're going to associate that low interest rate, 2.75, we're going to associate it with a condition. The condition will be that if the rates go above 5, then you'll be forced to pay floating rate. And the justification for doing that is to say, well, when the rates are high, people like to be able in a position to pay floating. But I don't know if you already spotted the trick in what I just said. It is interesting for you to have floating rate when they're high because you're betting on the possibility of it going down. But when you get a low fixed rate, because the market rates are low, it is not in your interest then to be able to be forced to switch automatically to a high floating rate when it gets high. The way that Dexia had managed the product, and apparently it is a financial engineer from J.P. Morgan who designed the product, and who was interviewed in a recent book called Dexia a produit une banque toxique by Nicolas Corry and Madame Le Gall. Nicolas Corrie is a economic journalist for the Libération daily in France. The justification for having that condition, that if the rates go really high, you will have to pay the floating rate, is that that condition will make it possible for Dexia to give you a rebate on the fixed rate to start with, the difference between the 3 and the 2.95. Why? Because it is a guarantee for the bank. The fact that when it goes really high, that you actually, the client will have to pay the very high floating rate, but being linked, how would I say, linked by the contract, it will not have the possibility of going from floating to a fixed one, possibly lower at the point. So you see how the justification, the commercial justification was given. Well, people like fixed when it's low, and they like floating when it's high. So let's make them a product where they get floating when it's high and fixed when it's right. Fixed when it's low rate. Okay. We're talking about two different situations. Putting it within one product is just pulling the client's leg. I mean, it's just, how would I say? And I don't want to use the word crookery because there are currently trials in France around that, and but that's essentially what it is. People say now, well, there was no good explanation that the product was speculative, but it's not. It was speculative. There was just a deception of the client. The client was told something different from what was actually done. It turns out that was that particular provision that if the rates were going really high, then the client would pay the high rates. It's just as if the bank was actually insuring itself against rate fluctuation. It is often called, the description of the product is say, well, they were associating a loan with a swap. But that's not true. It's not a swap. It's not a swap at all. It is an insurance. It is an insurance contract. And it is the bank that's insuring itself, and it is the client that's playing the role of the insurer. And what is the bank insuring itself against? It's the rates going very, very high. It is somewhat understandable then that the clients would not have seen this in the way it was wrapped, especially with that explanation coming around saying, well, isn't that what you like? You like fixed rate when it's low and you like floating when it's high. But not, of course, within the same product. But when these municipalities were sold variations on this product, and in particular, that it's not if the rates were going higher that they would have to start paying higher amounts of money, but as was the case in many of the products that were sold, it was if the differential in the exchange rate between the euro and the Swiss franc were going in a particular direction, then they would start to pay large amounts of money to Dexia. How could people, let's say, at the head of a small commune, of a small community in Belgium and in France, think that it was wise to buy a product that was indexed on the exchange rate of the Swiss franc? I mean, how did anybody persuade them that that was the right thing to do? I mean, what had their business in any way to do with the Swiss franc at all? I think in this case, I think what really played was precisely not maybe asymmetry in information, but asymmetry in understanding of financial products that was taken advantage from. Quite, I would say, not accidentally at all. At the time, and that's something which is underlined in the book by, not only in the book by Corrie, but also in the book written, Tijdbom, the book by Ardens about Dexia, the book which is written in Dutch. it is at the time that Dexia started selling these products that the wages and the bonuses of the leaders of the company really started going up. When Dexia itself fell as a company, it was not linked to the quality of their products, because the quality of the products was actually bringing money in. It was because they had built, well, I'll use again the word Ponzi scheme, because the portfolio of the bank had been built in such a way that it had to be renewed on a constant basis. And when you reach times like the mid-2007, when the capital market is frozen because there's no selling and buying between different banks, that's when it started being hit. Strangely, I'm saying miraculously, it managed to survive until 2012, despite that. And it also, over the years, it had acquired a monoline, what is called a monoline in the United States. I think that monoline was called AFS, if I remember rightly. And a monoline was a reinsurer about bonds. If you had bought a bond and you were worried about the fact that the value could go down, you could reassure yourself with a company like AFS. Now, what's interesting, I would say theoretically speaking, is that the reinsurance that AFS and the other monolines were offering the banks was at a particular level. You could reinsure you about possible, or actually insure you against a particular loss on a bond for a particular premium. You could actually pay a certain premium. What is interesting is that these products by themselves, because they were debt instruments, meaning that they were loans, they had within themselves already part of their interest rate a risk premium. And that risk premium was supposed to reflect the risk, which was the market risk, that there would be no reimbursement or payment of interest. But what is interesting is that these reinsurers, these monolines, they were taking to insure against the risk amounts which were much smaller than that risk premium. And that shows that, I mean, that doesn't make any sense in economic theory at all. I mentioned that at the time, you know, in 2008, when I was writing books about that and writing papers on my blog about that there were two prices for risk at the same time for the same product, and that the price that the monolines were assessing was much smaller than what the market was assessing to these products by determining the interest rate in the product. This is an anomaly which, I mean, has no possible justification. The fact that the monolines went down shows that their assessment of the risk was mistaken. But the fact that the whole industry came down shows that the risk premium was also miscalculated. It was all due to the fact that in accounting terms, that risk premium is not treated any differently than any profit. And that for that reason, people who receive that risk premium do not treat it at all as being something that should be part of the reserves of the provision being made. About the case of Dexia, the contracts and these famous contracts that were issued by the bank were, as I said, putting the borrowers in the position to act as an insurance company towards the risk that was possibly incurred by the bank. But in the same way, this was not recognized at all as being an insurance, and therefore these municipalities were not making any reserves, being totally unaware that they were playing the role of an insurance, technically speaking. In the book by Jorion and Legal, they tried to understand why regulators didn't see anything coming in that respect. They explained partially due to the fact that there was a directive in France from 1992 saying that it was forbidden to sell speculative products to municipalities. and that later on then people say, well, these products were actually speculative. How come people didn't notice? But as I said, they're not necessarily speculative. It's just that the buyer, the borrower is set in the position of being an insurer. So it is right that the product was not blatantly speculative. About why it became allowed to sell products which were indexed on the exchange rate between the Swiss franc and the euro, that's much more difficult to understand. It is the fact that that a small Belgian gemeente shouldn't buy a product which is indexed on the Swiss franc seems obvious to anybody. It might be that it was very much the climate of deregulation and privatization in those years, which led to, as the Americans say, of the regulator being asleep at the wheel, not doing his or her job, just because there was an atmosphere of anything goes. And I've seen that myself in the American industry, where a financial industry, when we received these letters from the regulator, and it was just left to sometimes very junior people to write a letter saying, whatever, yes, we were aware of the problem, working hard on it, and then there would be a stamp from the direction, and that would be about it. The fact that, sometimes when I arrived at Countrywide, and I was in a somewhat, not a very junior position, but a kind of mid-rank, and that I was given these letters saying, do something about it, the regulators are saying this, shows that there was not much concern, and that definitely the power balance between the regulator and then the regulated bank was very unfavorable to the regulator. I mentioned last year an incident which has nothing to do with the American industry, but that was my experience at ABN AMRO. I can say that now, I guess. In the year 1996, when I had slowed down a process of, there was a new type of risk management software. It was installed in the bank, and I was very much responsible for the accuracy of the numbers being produced by that piece of software. And I had slowed down the process because I had found a major error in the calculation. And there was a big cocktail party. I think it was for Christmas, and I was there, and a little man approaches me, and he said, "You know who I am?" And I said, "No." He said, "Because I know who you are." I said, "Well, okay." He said, "Because you are the man who's stopping the process and making us lose a lot of money. I'm so-and-so." And then I recognized, because I knew the name, he was number 2 or number 3 of ABN AMRO at the time. And then he was very mad. He was very angry at me, and he said, "You don't understand, young man, that..." Well, and yeah, I must have said something, "Well, we need to do that for the regulator." And he said, "You don't understand that I'm going to tell the regulator what the figures are, and that will be it." And then he left, and left me standing there. And what he was saying there, essentially, was that the power balance between the regulator and him was such that he could tell whatever he wanted to the regulator, and that was it. And that the regulator had no possibility, actually, to fight back. And that was long before the current, it was 10 years before the current crisis. So it may have been, I would say, an endemic, chronic condition of the relationship between regulators and regulated, which are often linked to, things of the type that I mentioned about Mr. Greenspan. I'm sure he was when he moved to Paulson, who had made billions from the downfall of the subprime industry, that I'm sure that Mr. Greenspan was better paid when he joined Paulson than when he was working at the Federal Reserve, because there are, and how would I say, justifiably so, there are limits to how much a civil servant can be paid, although it's a private, the Federal Reserve is a private institution. But still, I'm pretty sure there are limits to how much compensation these people can can receive, while it's not the case in the industry. Another, the final example I will give today about the, might be a counter-example about the working of the invisible hand, is the current situation in the United States, where we have the biggest nation in terms of its economy being in a gridlock, being very much paralyzed by the fact that 800,000 civil servants out of 2.9 billion, which is about 25%, have been sent home because the budget has not been voted, and they cannot be paid. And there are interesting articles over the weekend, like you know, people who wanted to get married in a national park in the United States can find the door closed. Or there was a quite moving, I would say, article in the Wall Street Journal about people wanting to visit the cemeteries from the you know, the First World War, the Second World War in France, near the beaches of the landing in 1944, or in the huge cemeteries from the First World War in La Somme, in these departments there in France, and that these people see the flag down and the door being closed on the cemeteries because people can't enter. This is, I would say, very much at the symbolic level. It doesn't mean that it's less of a problem for people who are staying home because their pay cannot be paid. But this is the major commercial power of the world. And this, people say, well, you know, that will be fixed in a couple of weeks. But in 3 days' time, the United States may be defaulting on its debt. Even if they do it for a couple of hours, that could still have a couple of hours only. That could still have a lot of consequences for the economy. Banks are getting ready already to the fact that the value of these bills or bonds that would come to maturity during that period, meaning that they should be repaid, coming to maturity during the period where then there wouldn't be, well, when the nation would be in default, the value is coming down. As you may know, these treasury bills, treasury notes, treasury bonds, they have different names, and the names are linked to the maturity, which is can be under 1 year, from 1 year to 5, or over 5 years. It has names like bill, note, or bond. It is assumed that the bonds, let's say typically with maturity for a number of years, that they will be paid in the end. But for those whose deadline falls in the days which might be the time of default, their value is plummeting, and they're quite understandably, their commerce, their trading is being stopped because nobody knows how long that default may exist. The difficulty is that, you know, people say, well, these things always get arranged at the last minute. They've come to an agreement. Well, the last time it's not the case. It didn't happen last time when there was a ceiling on the national debt, and they couldn't come to an agreement. And so what they did was something called a sequester. Sequester means that they started that payments on some type of expenses would be frozen. And they made a list. They made a list of the things that would be frozen, like some type of purchases by the army, and it was used as a deterrent. It was put in the law as a deterrent, so the Congress people and the senators would actually not even consider a shutdown. But they couldn't come to an agreement, and the sequester has already been starting. The process has already been starting. And with the shutdown, I mean, for instance, the factories which are producing for the army have to stop one by one because there's nobody, they can't deliver the product, they can just store it, they can't deliver it because there's nobody on the other side to even a default for a couple of hours would be really damaging, because, as you know, the dollar is still a reference money in the world. The countries which have large amounts of American debt instruments in their portfolio, like the first one is China, number two is Japan, have started making statements in the press which are pretty how would I say, strongly worded about I mean, that we all rely on the dollar to be reliable, and that on the fact that that debt instruments issued by American government have the status of quasi money, that they act in the economy as being as good as proper money. It would be impossible within a course like this not to have mentioned the urgency of the situation. I think that even the financial press doesn't take that information as seriously as it should, because it could be a real not only storm, but a cyclone starting that would even make the financial crisis of 2008 pale in comparison, because in this particular case we know exactly what are all the consequences. It's not only the trading between banks that would stop; it's trading altogether, and we're not ready. Some people are working here in, like Julien or Christina, writing theses which will fix things in the future. But we're not ready yet to have come up with a full-blown replacement approach to the existing monetary system. Okay, I will stop at this stage and allow you for some questions about these very earnest, serious questions I've been raising today. I think this type of lecture should have been instaured sometime in the past, maybe 20 years ago. In that case, we would have been more ready and could have possibly prevented some accidents like those which we see beginning prepared. The reason why it's so situation is so difficult in the United States is that there's such a polarization between the different parties now. It used to be said in Europe when I was a kid to say, well, they don't have a left and right like we have in political parties here, because if you look at that Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they're very much similar as far as we're concerned. And that view has changed. I mean, although it was somewhat justified, it was not as much justified as people believed at the time. The reason people had that view in Europe is because they didn't see so well, I would see, about the American culture as being different from the European one, and so that issues may be central to the political life in the United States would be things which are somewhat blurred when we look at it from here. But over the years, there's been a polarization, and to some extent, currently, it is I would say, the extreme left wing of the Democratic Party, which has the bargaining power, and it is the extreme right part of the Republican Party also. And so a dialogue between these two elements within the political landscape in the United States is much more difficult than it would be at times when the centrist elements of the parties would be more prominent. Mr. Obama also probably made a mistake at some point in the past years when he aligned himself, I would say, quite willingly on some of the extreme right positions developed within the Republican Party, because that gave the Republican Party the feeling that he may have in the end to align on that. What we've seen in the recent days is again Democrats asking more and more from their opposite party, and the Republicans entrenching themselves more and more also in their more, I would say, in their stronger claims about things. So although there's only 3 days left before the default, we don't see any closing up of the gap, quite the reverse, I would say, currently. There will be some meeting at the Senate House today, which, as you know, has a majority which is for the Democratic Party, while the House, so-called House, the Congress, has got a majority of Republicans. That also doesn't help, of course, to make views come any closer. Any question? Okay, thank you. Then I'll stop the lecture here. And it won't be next week, right? It won't be next week. It will be the following week that we meet again. Okay, thank you.